See if I'm doing this right. There we go. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Both on my YouTube live stream as well as my Periscope friends and audience here. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our book talk this morning. Just trying to straighten out our easel here. All right. I think we got it. So good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. And I'm excited about today. I thank God for being in the land of the living. And I hope that you are having a great and wonderful morning. My stand wants to give me some problems this morning, but hopefully that will stay. All right. So we are back again, day 14 of our reflections on race. And we are reading from White Like Me by Tim Wise. White Like Me by Tim Wise. Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. We have been learning a lot. We have been learning from his point of view about systemic issues. We've been learning about institutionalized racism. We've been learning about white supremacy. We've been learning about white privilege and all of those different kinds of components and things that we hear about on a regular basis, but he is really putting some skin onto these topics. So this is where we are today. We are back talking with Tim, reading his work and his adventures in college concerning his activism. Again, for those of you coming in, we are reading from White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. And please excuse my my stand. It's giving me a little bit of problems this morning. So I'm trying to fix that. All right. If you can hear and see clearly, I'm going to ask if you would put a heart up if you can see and hear clearly. Let's see if I can bring it over this way. All right, that should work. So thank you all for joining me this morning, just giving an opportunity for some people to come in. I know this may be a busy Wednesday for some, but thank you again for joining us. We are going to get into the reading in just a minute. White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. In case you don't know who Tim Wise is an anti-racism activist, and he is involved in the work of bringing awareness to the issues of systemic and institutionalized racism, as well as he does lectures and talks on these issues and helping people to understand what they are and how they are affecting our society today. So if you see me looking back and forth, it is because I'm also live streaming through YouTube on my YouTube channel, Church Love 333, so that I can have an archive there as well. So at this point in the reading, Tim Wise is sharing with us his school experiences, and he's taken us from elementary school to middle school to high school, and now we're reading about his experiences in college. We left off yesterday talking about the civil rights leaders that he had gotten a chance to actually meet, both white and black. And one of the things that he made clear in that is that oftentimes these people get left out of history books, right? They often their story never gets told because to tell their story would be to encourage and inspire and fire up, right, a whole other generation of activists. And what Tim Wise was saying is that many times, especially in America, we're not we're the land of the free and the home of the brave, but many times we don't necessarily want that next generation of activists fired up about injustice, particularly racial injustice. So that is where we were. I'm going to drink some of my hot pineapple juice here. This is a speaker tip for those of you who speak quite often, to help with my cold and my throat. So bear with me as I do that, and then we'll get right into the reading here. All right, here we go. Immediately before we left for Philadelphia, my mother and I had been out at the home of my dad's folks, visiting for Father's Day. We knew that 9 days later my grandfather would be going into the hospital for prostate surgery, was none too happy about it, and could use some cheering up. Papa had never been in good health. His leg had been amputated at the age of 16, the result of an infection that had set in after he was kicked by a horse. And throughout his life, there had been various complications from the amputation. Also, his diet was atrocious, consisting, so far as I could tell, of lox, gefilte fish, butter, and saltines. He also smoked unfiltered Lucky Strikes and drank more Chivas Regal than he probably should have. That he had made it to 70 was more than a bit surprising to some. 2 years earlier, I had become aware of how rapidly his health was declining when he had come to New Orleans for college basketball's Final Four. He had driven the 8 hours with one of his best friends, Cornelius Ridley, a basketball legend in his own right. Ridley had coached Pearl High School in 1966, the year they became the first black team in Tennessee history to win the state championship against white players, with Ridley becoming the first black coach to win a state title. Coach Ridley, Papa, and I had gone to the games, which included one of the most exciting finishes in championship history, in which Keith Smart of Indiana hit an improbable baseline jumper at the buzzer to beat Syracuse. But my grandfather had actually missed the ending, having become ill shortly after halftime, his blood pressure spiking and causing him to become so disoriented that he'd wandered back on his crutches to the hotel, thinking the game was over. Coach Ridley and I would find him there an hour later after both of us had begun to panic about his whereabouts. Though his health stabilized in the months following his trip to New Orleans, by 1989 he was struggling, his kidneys malfunctioning to the point of requiring dialysis, and his blood pressure dangerously high. During the Father's Day visit, I brought him a folder with every article I'd ever written to that point from the school paper and the alternative magazine I was writing for in New Orleans. He had been a journalist in college, and because he appreciated my politics, I figured it would mean a lot more to him than just another pair of socks. We had no idea that he wouldn't be coming out of the hospital. Though he definitely wasn't in good shape, there was nothing to indicate that this would be anything other than a routine operation. After handing him the folder with my essays, I expected him to put it aside and read it later, perhaps in a week or so, after returning from his surgery, but he read the entire thing, methodically consuming a few dozen short pieces, leaving my mom, Mabel, whom we call Mama, and me to visit with one another. It was as if he knew that if he didn't read them then, he wouldn't be getting the chance. Looking back, I should have known something was up with him. A few weeks earlier, I had stayed at Leo and Mabel's house. I still like to go and spend the night there sometimes when I was home from college to take advantage of the peace and quiet, and had a conversation with him unlike any I had had before. I remember him for the first time beginning to speak of his father. He was trying to tell me stories of what his dad had experienced in Russia, and about his journey to America, a story we only knew little bits and pieces of, principally the ones I shared earlier. Every time he started to tell a story, to actually provide me with a specific piece of information, his voice would trail off and he would start again, usually in a different place and on some totally different subject. He repeated the process a few times until it became obvious that he wasn't going to get out much. It wasn't that his mind was going or his memories were fading. Though his body was at the end of a journey, his mind was strong. The problem was that he literally didn't have any stories to tell, at least not complete ones. And the reason he didn't have any stories was because tales about the old country and a connection to that immigrant past were often the first casualties of whiteness, the first things that had to be sacrificed on the altar of assimilation. To hold on to those stories, let alone to pass them down, would be to remain stuck, one was told. It would stifle one from becoming fully American, which meant white American at the time of entry for European ethnics. So one had to begin the process of transformation. Don't seem too Jewish. Don't teach your children the language of their forebears, nor the customs. Don't talk about your old country. Put all that behind and become a new man, a white man. Only by giving up one's past could a person like Jacob Wise win a future for his children, so he was led to believe. Only in that way could he make others comfortable enough with his presence that they might welcome him and his brood into the American fold. It had begun innocently enough, or so it seemed, there on Ellis Island, being told by some immigration official that they couldn't understand the thick Yiddish coming off your tongue, so it would be necessary to give you a new name or to simply make one up. What was that, after all? Which were you garbling? Which you were garbling? Shuckleman, Sheckman, Shuckman, Shankman? Oh, to heck with it. Your name is now Wise. Not Weiss, Weiss, but Wise. Whitened and sanitized for your protection, with all due apologies to Alex Haley, a Jewish Toby. So one of the things that Tim points out here is that even with those who came over as immigrants, right, from European countries, that to a certain extent, they too had to give up their ethnic culture in order to assimilate into whiteness. And that's something that doesn't really get talked about unless, again, you're reading somebody's family history or personal account. The fact that not only did slaves, right, slaves who were entering here involuntarily, not only were they renamed and told, don't practice your belief system, or don't practice your cultural systems, or we're going to give you a new name. But that also happened with European immigrants. And that was a part of them too assimilating into being a white person in America. Because remember, whiteness is really not an ethnicity. Okay? Whiteness is a social categorization. So under the banner of whiteness, you have Italians, you have Jews, you have Germans, you have Polish, you have the Russians, right? In America. You even have East Africans are characterized in our census as white. So it's a social categorization. And what Tim is expressing here is now his father is at the end of his life, and he can barely recall some of the stories and even his heritage from the old country, as he says, because it was beat into him, not physically, but mentally, right? That if you're going to take on this whiteness, if you're going to assimilate into America, you can't be talking about your ethnicity. You can't be talking about where you came from. You got to learn to speak English, right? You can't go around talking in this heavy Yiddish language. So one of the things that he's pointing out is that even with white people or those who came from other countries, they too had to assimilate. And in assimilating, they too were willing or had to be ready to give up parts of their ethnic history in relation to their country in order to fit into this new America. Let's keep reading. Had the name been the only thing lost, perhaps it wouldn't have mattered. What's in a name, after all? Well, nothing except one's past, nothing except the intergenerational fiber that had kept your people together for generations, nothing except the story of how you survived. Nothing but that. So the process of whitening had begun, and now it was culminating in the inability of my grandfather, Jacob's son, to pass down any story, anything at all about his father, his mother, his grandparents, or the place from which he came. We know those stories would first have required that he had been taught them, and for him to be taught them would have required that Jacob had been willing to do so. And for his father to have been so willing would have meant that he had been able to resist the pull and lure of whiteness, but to do that had been unthinkable. So my grandfather joined our ancestors about whom neither I nor, oddly enough, even he knew much of anything. With him went my connection to the past, leaving me and now my daughters with nothing other than one half set of gold candlesticks, the only item smuggled out of Russia on that ship that Papa boarded so many years ago. I don't even know the story that goes with the candlesticks, but sadly, it is all I have left. All that is, except for my white skin. And though that skin provides me with innumerable benefits, it is hardly better than the candle in the candlestick at keeping me warm at night, because I know its true price. I know how much my family paid for it and for my name. I know because I saw in Papa's eyes that day what the cost of white privilege had been for my people, what it had exacted from my kinfolk as they hit the reset button on the game of life and stifled their traditions and cultures so they might find a place in this land. I know the cost incurred and the penalty paid by those who had to give up who they were because to become something they were not, white. I know because I saw the bill of sale, saw it in the silence between my grandfather and myself. It was a silence louder than any scream I had ever heard. Senior year began, and as usual, I was distracted from my studies. As had been my freshman year, I was once again in a long-distance relationship, this time with a woman at Vanderbilt who I'd met working at Greenpeace. And so every other weekend for several months that our relationship lasted, I was back and forth to Nashville. Luckily, by this point, I had enough credits under my belt to take a light load academically, including only 3 courses in my last semester, along with finishing up the honors thesis on the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. So even with the distractions, I managed to do all right. When the year started off, I had planned to focus most of my activist attentions on reinvigorating anti-apartheid movement that had faltered the year before. But even before a month had gone by, the campus was rocked by a racist scandal quite a bit closer to home. In mid-September, a cross was burned on the lawn of Delta Tau Delta House. Apparently, the fraternity had been targeted because it had just extended a bid to a Black student, Donnell Suarez, for the first time in the chapter's history. Someone, perhaps an alum, who wasn't too pleased about it. When the campus paper broke the news, which had been covered up for roughly 2 weeks by the fraternity itself and then by the administration, all HE double hockey sticks broke loose. It was bad enough that a cross had been burned, but the fact that the Delts hadn't seen fit to notify the proper authorities, a move that the head of the campus security blamed for hampering the investigation, it was near criminal. That the president's office had further attempted to keep the incident under wraps, thereby losing the opportunity to make a clear public statement condemning the hate crime, only compounded the offense. The fraternity clearly failed to appreciate the magnitude of the incident. At a press conference called by myself and several members of the school's Black student group, Chet Givens, the frat's president, explained they had remained silent about the hate crime because they didn't believe it was racially motivated or a campus issue. Interestingly, one of the members of the fraternity who remained stone silent for the 2 weeks of the initial cover-up was Andrew Breitbart, now one of the nation's most notorious right-wing commentators. And I will note that since this book writing, Andrew Breitbart was murdered. That's a whole other conversation. That Breitbart now claims to have been the person who pushed for Suarez's membership in the first place makes his silence and unwillingness to quit the group in the wake of their nonchalance even more pathetic. Some friend was Andrew. As for the administration, protecting the public image of the school took priority over forceful action, much as it had 3 years prior when the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity had marched through the middle of campus in blackface, taunting Black students with lit torches in a mock Mardi Gras parade. At the time, the president's office had said they were unable to punish anyone, despite the fact that the fraternity had been banned from campus and the torches were weapons being thrust in the faces of Black students, because they couldn't identify the perpetrators under all of that grease paint. An interesting twist on the all Blacks look-alike trope. The fact that the yearbook staff had no problem identifying these same students a few months later changed nothing. In any event, and in keeping with the inventive ways in which white folks so often manage to deny the existence of racism, even when the presence is obvious, there were many beyond merely Givens and the Delts who claimed the cross burning might not be racially motivated. Because the cross had only been 2 feet tall, they speculated, it might have had nothing to do with racism. Of course, because the way to discern motives of people who burn crosses is to always by the use of a handy slide rule. Though many of us blasted the administration's handling of the incident and gave them a much needed public battering for it, nothing much happened. No one was ever caught or punished for the act, and thus there was nothing to deter others from doing it again. As such, in January, 3 members of the Kappa Alpha Order fraternity, which celebrates the Old South and considers Robert E. Lee their spiritual founder, burned a cross in their own backyard. This time the story got out as soon as it happened, thanks to the other members of the fraternity who hadn't been involved in the incident and reported those who had. But then too, the denial was creative. The frat boys who had burned the cross actually went so far as to say that they had no intention to do so, but were merely adding wood to a bonfire in their backyard when 2 pieces happened to fall into a cross-like position in the flames. It was all a big misunderstanding. Yes, we dress up in Confederate uniforms and march down St. Charles Avenue every year, all the way to Robert E. Lee Circle, waving Confederate flags, but we're not racist. And that cross was just a coincidence. When it was pointed out that Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard sign had been tacked to the horizontal bar on the cross, that too was written off as coincidence. As one brother pointed out, that he had no idea how that might have gotten there. After all, they would have had to go into the Black part of town to steal a sign like that, and that would have been too dangerous. Yes, it was sure good to know the KAs weren't racists. Interestingly, a valuable lesson emerged from the community discussion that followed this incident. At the outset of the evening, one white man rose to ask a question for which he apologized at the outset, so certain he was that it would prove offensive. He noted that he was a KA himself, and although he recognized why a burning cross was offensive to him as a Christian, he honestly had no idea why it was offensive to Blacks. Could someone please explain it to him? He wanted to know. Wow, I'm going to take a sip on that. So they're at a community meeting discussing this incident of a cross burning by a fraternity, and someone, fellow college student, fellow fraternity person, gets up and says, hey, I can understand why cross burnings would be offensive to me as a Christian, but I don't understand why it's offensive to Black people. Can someone explain it to me? At first, everyone gasped, taken aback by such lack of awareness, and in a few cases, ready to pounce on the kid for his ignorance. But then it hit us. He really didn't know. He wasn't trying to minimize the severity of what his fraternity brothers had done. He simply had never been told anything about the history of that symbolism, its use by the Ku Klux Klan, going back over 120 years, and the way burning crosses had been utilized to terrorize Black families in the South and elsewhere for generations. That he didn't know these things was hardly his fault. His schools had never seen fit to teach them, probably concerned that such lessons would detract from the far more palatable narrative of America's greatness, exceptionalism, openness, and commitment to liberty for all. He had been lied to, as had the rest of us. The fact that a few of us had gotten the truth from parents or mentors was hardly something over which we had the right to be smug. It simply meant that we had an obligation to struggle with him as we would want others to struggle with us for our own moments of ignorance. People like that young man couldn't be written off, especially by other whites, content that our own radicalism somehow made us superior. He was one of us after all, and there are plenty of times the rest of us hadn't seen things clearly either, or wouldn't in the future, as I would soon learn. This concludes our reading for today. Tim Wise begins to open up this whole idea of ignorance, that, you know, even you can be a person who thinks that they are well educated, but you can still be ignorant in certain subject matter, and you got to be willing to have patience with those who may not be aware, or you got to have patience with those who may not have the same level of information that you do, right? Tim Wise, as far as I know, in this book, he's talking about how his parents have tried to, in the beginning when we first started reading, he's talking about how his parents have tried to make him more socially conscious, right? More socially aware. And they started out with in his kindergarten years, deliberately putting him into an environment that was predominantly Black, where he was able to learn from African American teachers, where he would be around Black children. So his parents, all throughout his life, were trying to make more of a conscious effort of letting him understand that he shares this world with other people besides the ones that look like him. Many times, as he has demonstrated in this book earlier, many times white Americans, if they want to, they can really remain isolated from other people groups. It's much easier for them to do that than it is for other people groups to remain isolated from them. So it is very possible, and I know, you know, from personal experience in my own life, it is very possible for people to get to the level of higher education and still be ignorant about some of the atrocities that have happened in history. Because if you're only being fed a curriculum, especially by public school, if you're only being fed a curriculum that says how great America is, that America is always right, right? If you're being fed a curriculum that only speaks to the greatness of America, rather than talking truthfully about some of the things we did as a nation, some of the things we did as a country, the wars and the treaties and all of those different things, the betrayals of other people groups. If you're not getting an honest take on American history, then yes, you can get to the higher education level and not have ever heard anything about the Ku Klux Klan. You can get to a higher education level, and the only knowledge you have of any black person who did something good might be Martin Luther King Jr. and maybe one other person, right? They may give you a little bit of Malcolm X as kind of an opposing view to MLK. But this is, I mean, this, go to any university and start asking people, do you know who Ida B. Wells is? Do you know who Fannie Lou Hamer is? And you'll probably get some people that will say, no, I don't know who these people are. Do you know who Margaret Sanger is? Do you know what eugenics is? And so one of the things that Tim is coming to realize is, just because a person is in college doesn't mean that, you know, they've had an expansive education, or that they have been educated about social injustice, or they've been educated about civil rights. And so because of that, you have a lot of people who are just now starting to do their own research, even as adults, to find out, why are African Americans upset? Why are African Americans tired? Why are African Americans marching in the streets? Trust me, if you have not had a proper education, you probably think it's just black people out in the streets being ignorant and marching for no reason. But when you get a full comprehensive view on what has happened to black Americans in this country since 1619, then you will begin to understand why some people in this generation are simply fed up. So again, good point. Just because somebody is in higher education doesn't mean that they have been properly educated prior to getting to higher education. This has been our reading for today. I hope that you have gotten something out of it. I would encourage you, if you want to read along with us, to get the book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. We will be doing this hopefully throughout the year. We're going to pick up another book after we finish this, and that book is by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is called Between the World and Me. He's a Baltimorean, I believe, and so he's going to be talking from a black man's perspective to his son. And so this is what we're doing. I hope that you will stay tuned, that you will join in. We'll be back again tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we try to keep our readings between 30 to 45 minutes long. All right. So thank you again for joining. I hope that you will have a great and wonderful day. This is Wednesday, Winsday. And I hope that you accomplish your goals today. Take care and God bless. All right. And thank you for joining me through YouTube live stream. I hope that you will take care and God bless, and share this video. Thank you.